Okay. So we are so excited to have Titus Heagins here tonight. He has been a favorite photographer of mine for many, many years. For those of you that don't already know him, he lives and works in Durham, North Carolina. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Duke University, as well as an MFA degree from the School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. Heagins' work can be found in collections of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, and the Casa de Africa in Havana, Cuba, among many others. We were especially excited to talk to Titus tonight. One of the things that we have loved about his work and our community talks about a lot is the role of relationship in photography. And we know that for Titus, actually many of the relationships that he's photographed and the people that he's photographed has stretched out over a 20-year span of time. And so one of the things we've asked him to start off with is giving us just this incredible tour of his work over a stretch of time, and then we're going to move into some other questions and some other topics. So we welcome you, and we're so grateful that you're here.
Well, I'm glad to be here. And I'd like to start off with a reminder of a poem that was written by a Black poet, Paul Laurence Dunbar. And the poem is about we wear the mask. And it was a poem that speaks directly to the lives of African Americans throughout their history in this country. So, and I'm going to go now. Let's make sure that everyone's got everything. Okay, there we go. So everyone's got that up. I hope you can see that. And let's move. Let's continue. So my experiences as a professional photographer started in 1997. And it began when I took a group of Duke students to the World Youth Festival in Havana, Cuba. And I came back, and unfortunately, the place that I was working at as a program director, well, my position, I was told that it was no longer needed. And if I can get it to, doesn't seem to be advancing. Okay, let's see. I'm having a little bit of technical.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. So there we go. Let's back up. So when we got to Havana, and after about a day and a half of being in the sun, we were scooped up by this older Cuban man and this Cuban woman. And this is Iran. And this, we lived with Iran and his wife, Amelia, for the next 20 years of my experiences of photographing in Cuba. And this is his wife, Amelia. This is the last photograph I took of her, which was about 2 years ago. And it was just before they had retired and moved from Havana to Spain. And working in Cuba was really what shaped everything about the way I photograph. Instead of shooting a lot of street scenes, because I had this connection with this Cuban family, I was allowed into the homes of many Cubans. And so I started creating what I think are these somewhat intimate photographs of people and their homes. So I've got a thing that says start my video. I can't hear you at all.
You're good. You're back. Your slides were up, but your video face was gone. So now we have both. So
okay.
Thank you. Just keep going.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So anyway, so I started doing these portraits of people in their homes and in their own environments. And I actually I was interested in Cuba because of a childhood movie that I saw. I think I was probably about 12, and it was about the Cuban Revolution, but of course it didn't necessarily name Cuba, but it was about this Caribbean island, and it was where there was a certain class of people who owned everything, and then there was this working class who did all of the work and shared none of the benefits. And there was this revolution that promised to give the people who were working a share of what was coming from the island. So I was very much interested to see how this experiment in this socialist country that was 90 miles from our shore, how things were actually worked. And I was also interested because we were barred from going there, which of course even piqued my interest.
How did you get it?
I'm sorry? Hello?
It's okay. Somebody just had their, didn't have their mic muted. It wasn't a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I seem to, well, let's see if, that's it. Okay. All right. So these images are some of the images that I created during that period of working in Cuban homes. Now, part of the reason that I was very interested in these Cubans' images was because of the social situation there. And it was one of the places in the world that I traveled to that I really felt comfortable. I didn't feel as if people were fearful of me when they got on elevators. It was a place that I just simply felt comfortable just simply by being there. So I really fell in love with Cuba. I fell in love with Cubans, and I fell in love with the access that I was allowed there in Cuba, and which lasted over a number of years. So I got access to places such as this one, which is called the Wedding Palace. And this is in an area that's called La Prada, which is a walkway between the capital and the Malecon. And it's where everyone used to go and get married on a Friday, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And so there were these two Afro-Cuban women who basically gave me access to the entire building. They let me go and photograph wherever I wanted to. And it was just an absolute amazing thing to witness and also to participate in as a photographer, because many of the people who came there to get married did not have a photographer, and that I was there. And so many times I would be taken home with this young couple who had just gotten married, and they would just basically push me into a car and we would drive off to some area in Havana that I didn't have any idea of where I was, but I was always treated kindly, and I was always able to get these beautiful images. And I was able to share them because I started shooting digitally. So I would make them a copy of all of the images, image files, and just basically give to them. And that was an amazing wedding present for the Cubans. And all of these images are images of people that I had relationships with. This is a young Cuban boy named Ronald. And Ronald was part of the household when I started doing my work on Cuban transgender men. And I've been doing this work for the past 5 years in Cuba, but he lived in the house where the person that served as my translator, sort of my fixer, the person that introduced me to other people within that small community of friends that were there. And I've always been amazed at what are the iconographic things that are within their households. So this was a place that I was just walking by on the street and was invited in, talked with the family, ended up photographing them. And I think I took this photograph probably at about 11 o'clock on a Friday or Saturday night. So it was sort of late, but people were welcoming. They invited me in. I think we drank a little Havana Club. I talked about my experiences in America. I talked about and tried to understand what their experiences were like in Havana and what they had hoped for in their lives from the revolution, which was always interesting. After Cuba, I began working in Haiti. And I went to Haiti because of a class that I took in African American history at Duke, and with a professor, a guy by the name of Ray Gavins. And I fell in love with the idea of the Haitian Revolution because this was the second place that gained freedom in the Americas from a West, from the West. So it was very important for me to go to Cuba, for me to go to Haiti. I was looking for the spirit of the revolution there, but when I got to Haiti, I was somewhat disappointed because there was such strong poverty. And I wandered for a while. I think I languished somehow in Haiti for about 2 years. And then I started photographing spiritual ceremonies. And that's where I found my place in Haiti. And there were these ceremonies that were related to water. And I absolutely love photographing them. And these were happening at different times of the year, all over the island. And so I would travel to the island, say maybe 4 or 5 times a year. I did this for about 6 years in Haiti. I stopped going to Haiti shortly after the earthquake. It just became too difficult for me to go back and see the destruction in the country, and also to realize how difficult it was going to be to rebuild an island that had so many problems before the earthquake. In Haiti, I also began doing portraiture. And the idea that I wanted to address in Haiti about doing portraiture is I began photographing in this, what I call this counter-narrative way, of these visual experiences and lives of descendants of Africa. This is a young woman, her name is Fabienne, and I photographed her and her family. They live in the northern part of the island. I liked her father, who was a very kind gentleman. His name was Louis Jean, and he brought me home one evening and for me to photograph his family. We had met in a park. I was sleeping, I was tired, I'd been working all day, and he came and he lay down close to me, and I was kind of wondering why he was there, and we started this conversation. He spoke very little English, and my French is not really good, but we ended up going back to his home. I photographed her, I photographed his entire family. They lived in this house, dirt floor, no running water, no electricity, but there was this amazing beauty that was there with his family, how they loved each other, how they smiled at each other. I absolutely just love Fabienne. This was in the middle of her hair being done by her mother. And I just, this contra way of showing this young woman with this black hair that's in the middle of being prepared for, for every day. This is at another one of the water ceremonies. And as we can see, this young woman is lying on this rock. She's in a trance, and her family is standing around her to protect her, to make sure that she doesn't hurt herself. And this was something that I really liked about the Haitian spirituality and about their expressions with their preferred religion, which is voodoo. And it's voodoo is very similar to Santeria in Cuba, is very similar to Candomblé in Brazil. But it's a religion that's mixed with Catholicism, and the deities are very similar, and that's how they continue to practice it. And it's more than just a religion. It's about a way of life, a way of living. Next, I began work on a body of work that's called Durham Stories. And East Durham is an area that I live very close to. It's an area that's being gentrified. It's an area that reminds me of the neighborhood that I grew up in Houston, which was an African-American neighborhood, about 6 blocks by 8 blocks, but it was surrounded by whites and Latinos on one side, by whites on another side, by a freeway and a large field on the fourth side. But everyone was mostly, were really poor. But it reminded me of the experiences of growing up and visiting my grandmother. My grandmother was a principal in a small East Texas town called Moscow, Texas. And she used to take me around when I visited her, as we visited people who lived out on these dirt roads. And they were small African-American farmers, and the land had been in their family since shortly after slavery, of which my grandmother was one of the families who owned land that had been gained by her father, by her parents, shortly after emancipation. So when I think about constructing an image, for me, it's a collaboration between me as a photographer and the sitter. And what I try to do is I want to end up with an image that is a contradiction to the negative images of representation of African Americans. And I think that being committed to this viewpoint has shaped my identity and my experiences as an African American as I'm threading through this path in American society. This is one of the families. This man is we call him 6-0. And 6-0 is in his 50s now. He owns his house, which is kind of unusual for East Durham. Even these small houses that are really, really meager are mostly rental houses, but he's one of the few guys who owns his house. And he lives in this house. It's actually larger than what it looks, because there are 3 generations of his family that live with him. His son, and then he has 2 grandkids that are children of his son that live with him. 6-0 is really an interesting guy, very intelligent, but as I traverse this world as another African-American man, has the type of image that I think that most people would never approach. But if you stop and you talk to him for 5 minutes, then you realize how bright this man is and just how hard he works and how difficult his life is. As far as speaking about the relationships in my photography, this is Chris and Xavier. They are part of a family that I photographed for the past 10 years, and I photographed just about everyone in their family, from these young boys to their aunt, who is this albino African-American woman, to their grandparents. We've been invited to everything from weddings to funerals. We share Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners with them. So when I talk about photographing someone, it's not just for an immediate time. It's not a short period of time. It lasts a very long time. And I think that in doing so, this is a part of what keeps me honest about what and how I present the images of those that I photograph. Another part of Durham Stories is a body of work that I call Small Town Girls. And these are young women or women who have worked in the sex trade. And this is one of the women who has retired herself, and she's living on social services, lives in her first non-abusive relationship in all of her life. And it's always interesting to talk to people and find out what are the reasons, what are the things that bring them to the situations that they're in. And I think that this can only be done when you try to find and form some sort of relationship with people. It can't be done when you go in with a camera and you shoot very quickly and you walk out. I don't think you understand who they are. And I think it's only when you come with some understanding of who people are that you are willing and able to photograph them in a way that is honest, that is true to who they really are and how they would like to be photographed. This young man, Chris, I photographed his family for about 5 years. I lost track of them because they moved so much. They were so poor that they were constantly being evicted from their homes about every 3 to 4 months. And so it just got to be impossible to keep track of them. The next image is of Chris, and this is his cousin. And the same thing was happening with their situation. You know, it was like everybody you would go there and photograph them one time and talk to them. And if you didn't come back within 3 weeks, they may be gone. And it may take you 6 months to find out where they went. This young man is Devontae. This is one of the images that I'm, pretty well known for. It's in the North Carolina Museum of Art and some other places. I met Devontae because he was standing on a bus stop with his mother. He was about 5 at that time, and she was looking for a job. And if you can imagine the issues of a young African-American woman with a child in tow that's looking for employment. And it was at a really bad time because apparently she was going to be evicted from her home the very next day. So I waited around until I could photograph Devontae, and he was standing there with no shirt on. And essentially, I moved my camera around him. I didn't ask him to move or anything, but this is how he presented himself. A lot of times when people look at this image, they talk about his stance, his stare of him appearing older as he's had so many experiences. But I kind of liken that to the fact that in so many cases and so many times, when we look at African-American men, we look at them as older because that also opened the doors to the criminal justice system, for them. One of the other things that I try to do is I look for people who have had deadly encounters with the police. And this is a family who within 6 months had 2 of their men killed by Durham police departments. And this was one of them. The last person that was killed was shot about 15 feet from his front door. There was no weapon that was ever found. The police really haven't answered much to the particular situation. And this was her brother, and she's sitting here in this apartment with her aunt, and she's still trying to find ways to find some sort of justice or to bring some sort of particular attention to what's happened to her family with the lives being lost of 2 men. These are members of 6O's family. I photographed a wedding for me. They asked me if I would photograph one of their cousins' weddings, and of course I said yes. I always try to make myself available to do whatever I can to give to people in whatever way that I can. The other thing I do is I have a habit of whenever I do a portrait of someone, I always give them a portrait that I make. And it's because a lot of times people don't have photographs of their family, of themselves. And I always make this as a promise that I always keep. And it's something that I figure that it keeps me honest. They get to see what image that I'm going to show of them so they know what they're going to look like as I exhibit these images. I was particularly interested in this image because I like the art that's on the wall, and that's an Ernie Barnes painting that's on the wall. If some of you remember, there was a television show called Good Times in the 70s, and this was one of the main images that the television show portrayed. So for me, the question is, how do you capture something about the soul of a person in a few minutes when you're doing a portrait? I sort of think that's impossible. One of the things when I meet someone that I hope to photograph is that in a conversation, I tell them something that's very revealing about my life. I let them know something personal about me. You know, I want to make this be some sort of exchange, an exchange of life stories, to say that my life is similar to yours, that I understand how you live, and that I live very similarly. And I think that that goes a long way with getting people to open up and to relax and to realize why you're there. And so I would always ask for anyone that's going into a community to photograph that's not their community, that they ask themselves, why are you going into this community? What is it that you hope to get from this community? What is it that you hope the people will give you? And what will you do with that? And how will you be honest with them about who you are? One night, I went to one of my favorite restaurants in Durham, which is this Mexican place called La Vaquita. And it's an outdoor kind of eatery. And there was this young couple that was sitting there. And it was very clear that they were very much in love. And it was very clear that they were immigrants. I started talking to them, and we got around to, and I always have a camera with me, you know, of sort, just always. And so I talked to them about why they came to America. And one of the things that I learned in this conversation from them is that they came to this conversation because they were so in love, and they felt that this was the only place that they could come and could express their love freely, and that they could just simply be happy and live a life together. And so after about 10 minutes of talking with them, I started photographing them. And this is Marco and Irma. And they were working at the local, there was a hamburger place. And I can't think of the name of it right now, but they worked there for about 3 years. And then they disappeared from there the last time I went in to check on them and find out how they were doing. Another body of work that I've been doing is on African American twins. And I really like this idea of seeing this duality, you know, these two people who are just one almost. And this is Fred and Ned there in South Carolina. I love the blue shirts. You know, it's just one of those images, it just speaks to you. This is Bubbles at the Inkwell. The Inkwell is a tattoo parlor that I photographed for probably about the last 15 years. It's moved 2 times, but it's a place where people of different races come. It's an amazing place. It's kind of a place that when I think about, when I look at this image, it always brings me back to the idea of Joseph and Mary. And when Jesus, you know, the child was born, and I see this young African-American woman, and, you know, she has this sort of halo around her. And she's this Madonna figure for me. And I think that the Inkwell is the place that someone like Joseph and Mary would have come to look for refuge. And it's the kind of place that they would have gotten an answer of where they could have found a safe harbor to go on a dreary, cold, rainy, harsh night. We were driving back from New York one night. This was in August. This was several years ago. And I stopped for gas about halfway. and there was a young man that was walking around outside, and he was just, it was almost like he was policing the area. And I saw his tattoos, and I wanted to photograph him. So I went and I got my camera. I started talking to him. It turns out that he had spent time in a Michigan jail. So we had this thing in common. So I likened my experience at the University of Michigan with his experience in jail. And so we ended up, I photographed him for about an hour that night. He was living in a tent in a vacant field across the street, and he was policing this area because the night before, apparently, some guys had tried to rob this store, and where there was this elderly woman who was the night clerk. And he had taken upon himself that he was going to protect her and make sure that nothing like that happened to her again. And so this is, it's kind of, this odd thing for someone who had been in jail for some sort of criminal enterprise. Why would he take it upon himself to protect this woman? It would seem that with his life experience, he would be on the other side. He would be trying to help the guys that were taking the money out. But instead, here he was going to become a part of the protection. Another one of my inkwell photographs. So why do I photograph African Americans? And I think that Black Americans are pretty much the center of a lot of the visual conversations.
Titus doing a talk.
I'm
Titus,
sorry?
I'm sorry. It's your cousin doing a talk. He's doing a webinar.
Oh, okay. Kim, could you mute yourself? Because you're... Okay. So, but I think that African Americans are the center of this visual conversation. I do think that sometimes that these stories need to be told by African American photographers. And because I want to be sure that the narrative of African Americans is not told in a way that continues to disempower Black people within the society that we live in. We think about exploitation of Black bodies in art, in photography, in paintings, certainly in the media. And we think about how these images that are publicized, that they don't necessarily fit the narratives, the true narratives of what the African American experience is truly like and who we really are. So about 2 years ago, I was in Mississippi, and I was in Jackson. And so I was driving around to look for people to photograph. And I went through this neighborhood that it was clear that the neighborhood was just about gone. And it was this street that there must have been, say, maybe 15 houses on, but maybe only 2 of the houses were occupied. Most of the houses, you can see that there were trees growing through them, that it was clear that someone had not lived in the homes for quite a while. But on this street, there was this gathering of maybe about 20 people. And so Maureen was driving, so I said, let's turn down here and go down here. And so we stopped in front of the house, and we got out, and I started talking to the people, asked them what was going on. And so what it turned out is that this woman, whose name is Patrice, was having a barbecue. And she was selling barbecue because her daughter had died the month before. And so as I'm asking her further about the story, so it turns out that her daughter had suddenly discovered that she had cancer and that she was going to die within a week. And so there wasn't much that could be done. So what Patrice decided to do was she was going to raise money for the American Cancer Society. Now, this woman and this group of people who were there were selling barbecue sandwiches for $2. And as I eventually, on subsequent trips, went into her home, I found out that Patrice did not have furniture in her home. And more importantly, that she had also been given custody of her daughter's 5 children. So she had suddenly these 5 young kids that she was responsible for. So I posted this story on my Instagram account, and someone from Phoenix, a woman from Phoenix named Shayla, decided that she wanted to contribute and help out. And so she contacted me directly and asked me if I was going back to Mississippi. And so she sent a rather generous check. And so the next time I was in Mississippi to photograph, I bought her children clothes. I gave them money for food, money to buy a mattress for some of the children to sleep on who had been sleeping on the floor. But the thing about all of this is that through this experience, I can't forget about the generosity of Patrice. Here's this woman who doesn't even have furniture in her living room, and she's trying to raise money for the American Cancer Society for people who may have developed cancer, who don't have any money to fight the disease. This is her grandson. This is Ashton. And this is the house across the street from them. And as he's leaning against this deserted car. This is another grandson. His name is Quintephilus. And as he's got one of the t-shirts that bears his mother's photograph on. He graduated from high school, had no particular plans, and he was looking for a job the last time I talked to him still. Another one of my Mississippi portraits. These 2 young African-American women are teachers. They drove 60 miles one way every day to teach school in this town. They lived in a small town that's called Vidon, Mississippi, and it's a town where there was some real racial unrest in the 1930s. But they refused to leave the town because this is where their family is from. And so that there was this area of where most Black people met that was about a block away from the main highway. And as we were driving by, I saw them and I decided to stop. And I spent about 3 hours there talking with people. And it took me about an hour and a half to convince these 2 women to give me this portrait. This is the beginning of some of my trans work in Cuba. And I started this work 5 years ago. And actually, 5 years ago in 2015. And I met this young group of trans women, and it's probably a group of about 20 people that live in Havana. And then they have other friends that live in other areas that come to Havana. And so I've been able to photograph them in their homes, quite intimately, either themselves alone or them with their lovers, them with their families. And it's been an amazing experience. The images I love, I think, are absolutely beautiful. So before the COVID-19 pandemic began, I was actually in Havana, and I came back about 2 days before everything closed down, and I barely made it back inside the country. This is one of the last images that I photographed in Havana. Every now and then the thing just kind of jumps there. No, that's not right. Let's see if I can back up. There we go. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how I like to use Instagram. So for me, Instagram, it's an art platform. It's an art institution. And what I like to do is I like to do political and some visual activism. I like to talk about the stories of the people that I photograph so that it's not solely about the images, so that you can learn more about who they are, what their lives are like, and perhaps you can bring some additional things to understand what these experiences are about and why we need to work on issues of social justice. And when I think of photographs, I always remember that photographs are this part of media that give us this right to stare, not just to stare, but also to stare from a position of safety. These are still images of trans in Cuba. And now we begin the images that are on the various protest movements that are happening now in the country. So in doing this work, well, one, I was really hesitant to do it because I felt it was just really dangerous going out within crowds of people with the fear of contacting COVID-19. So I had to figure out how to do that. How could I make myself safe enough to where I could capture the types of images that I like to capture? I don't own a telephoto lens. I like to shoot wide angles. I like to get close to whomever that I'm photographing. And that I felt put me in a particular type of danger. And as this image, this is in the protest for the Open Up Raleigh, Open Up North Carolina, which was mostly happening in Raleigh, North Carolina, the state capital. And so there was this image of this man who would come to all of the times that there were protest rallies to open the state, that was dressed in this figure as the death figure. And I guess to offer some sort of maybe persuasion to say that maybe we shouldn't do this. This is an image that came from one of the anti-KKK rallies in Durham. And I particularly like this image because there's such historical context that's going on in this image. As we see, this woman has this sort of smoking thing here, and she's waving the smoke on the protesters. And this reminds me of a lot of the things that I saw in the Santeria ceremonies that I photographed in Cuba, of the voodoo ceremonies that I photographed in Cuba, and of some of the things that that I made myself, that I avail myself to in order to get in to photograph some of these ceremonies. So I had to be blessed by this person before coming into their place of rituals. And that happened to me about, oh gosh, at least 3 or 4 times a year, whether I was in Cuba or whether I was in Haiti. So there were so many people that were photographing these rallies, these demonstrations. And I started trying to think about, how should I do this? How should I photograph them? There are people who photograph them like Sheila Bright or Sheila Bright Free that I think made absolutely wonderful and amazing images. And I didn't want to create images that were similar to hers that were similar to those that were like what other people were doing. So what I started thinking at first about photographing the crowds, but what was it about the crowds that I was interested in? And what I came to realize was that it wasn't just the crowds, that it was about the people that were in the crowds. And so I started trying to figure out ways that I could isolate people, that I could isolate them and the signage and with what they do, so you could see the emotion that they brought and the sincerity which what they came out with. And I tried to do that with both groups, because we've got on one side, we've got people who are protesting to open up the state, and we've got on the other side people who are protesting about Black Lives Matter. And as usual, there's always, when I do this stuff, I wonder about how I'm going to present the images, whether it should be color, black and white. I have to admit, I'm sort of a lazy photographer. I don't like going through the work of converting digital images into black and white. But sometimes I think that images speak to us more in color. But most of the times I think that black and white is how I want the images of protest to be shown. So I began isolating people in my first trip to DC when I photographed Black Lives Matter there. And essentially what I started doing was finding people that were in the crowds and getting them to a place outside and away from the crowds, and actually doing a portrait of them. Sometimes that wasn't possible. Sometimes, you just had to figure out a way to just do it there. Really like this guy here in the middle of the street with, his, from Puerto Rico. And I like the idea that supporting Black Lives Matter became this international event. It became this multiracial thing to do, that it wasn't just African Americans who were doing that. But also I liked in particular the use of the American flag at the Open, North Carolina events. I liked the way that they depended on a lot of the language that had to do with the American Revolution, speaking of tyranny, speaking of rebellion, all of these things that were mixed in with these notions of modernity. The bed of a pickup truck with their cooler in the back, with this plastic bag that contains all of this water, that's there. All of these things coming together under the auspices of the American flag that's waving across this pickup truck with the door open. What does that really mean for these guys who are out here protesting? There are so many people with Keep America Great or Make America Great flags also that were changed from the North Carolina state flag with these mottos on it. And everyone had an American flag. So I like this one. This guy's on his cell phone. He's talking to someone. He's got the flag. As the flag drapes across this woman's face, and her face is not important, but the fact is that she's got her flag, and right under the flag you see the words free, and then not fear on the other side of the Jeep there. Another time when I was able to isolate someone and their face and their sign was important. So I guess that one of the things that I have to try to think about how I'm going to deal with is how this premise of the photographic lens and how it has the ability to shape and condition radical and racial behavior. Because we need to understand that everyone has a right to be recognized justly in this democracy. And how do you do that when you're a photographer? And of course, you have your own political views. And how do you not let your political views affect how you photograph those whose political views who may be in opposition to yours? And I believe this may be my last slide. No. So this man was protesting, and he was there. He was quite upset because apparently a friend of his who was a firefighter who had been just staying home because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And apparently the young man committed suicide because, as he said, he couldn't take just simply staying at home and doing nothing. But of course, when we look at his tattoos, his ink, we see that he's part of the 3% movement. And, what does all of that mean? And what does that imply? And I particularly like this man who talked about let the vulnerable 10% stay at home and the other 90% go to work. But throughout the entire time of the protest, he sat in the back of his truck and never moved 1 inch. So it was clear that he was part of the 10% who should have stayed at home. And this, of course, was one of the signs that this young kid had. And I'm certain that he didn't make this out himself, but this is one of these kicks at the governor of North Carolina, and I wondered if this kid even understood what the sign meant. So when I think of documentary portraiture, I think about giving a face to those who remain faceless. I think about the outcast, I think about the indigent, the poor, the forgotten, those who have become in our collective memory so emblazoned and desensitized that we don't recognize that they deserved not to be ignored. And I think that that's the reason that people come out and protest and risk their lives, risk their futures, because there's something so wrong. And this is in Raleigh. When I got there, I was there probably about 5 minutes, and I was only able to take 2 photographs. And fortunately, they were fairly good. But immediately after I got there, and I got between the police and the people who were protesting, then the tear gas, came out. And because my wife has asthma and you know, there are immune things that I'm dealing with. I had to leave. I really like this photo with this young woman that has everyone's poster image that's been killed by police recently. And then if you can see the young girl that's to her left that has a sign that says, "I can't breathe." And the tree that reminds me of the song Strange Fruit. It's a magnolia tree with one magnolia bloom over here that's clear. And these photos of people who have fallen, you know, to the police. And of course, this is at the church that the president walked across the street, moved the protesters out of his way. And so when I was there, this person had apparently made themselves, constructed a Bible, you know. And the sheer number of people who are killed each day by people in this country, on average, 3 people a day. And the quote from Malcolm X harkens back to the time of when I protested in the 70s and the 60s. You know, it just reminded me. And this is in Richmond. Still in Richmond. And this should be the last one. Yeah. Whoa, sorry about that. Go back to screen share. Okay, there we go. Are there any questions?
Titus, I have a question. This is Susan.
Yeah.
So last week when we were talking to Ed Cashy, he talked about sort of letting go of this idea of fair coverage, and that he had kind of come to this place in his work that he just felt like there are some things that are just wrong, and that we don't have to tell both sides of the story. But I hear you saying something else, and I feel like you're bringing more compassion or something to that conversation, but I would just like to understand that a little better.
Well, you know, when I think
Hey,
of
Titus,
yes,
before you answer Sue's question, I want to add a corollary to that. I was struck by the fact that you were able to get people on the other side of some of these issues to let you take their photos. I'm curious about what the dialogue was between you and those individuals that permitted you to take those photos. And if you could answer both of those questions and correlate and sort of correlate those two questions for me, I'd be curious about.
sure. So I think that I think that we have to come to some understanding as to why we are at this point of crisis in this country that we are. And I think it's because there have been so many things that have divided us and have made us not see the commonalities that we all share. And I grew up in this poor Black neighborhood, 6 blocks by 8 blocks, which is really small. And I had a bicycle. I got a bicycle for Christmas. I got a motorcycle when I was in the, I think, 10th grade. And there were no Black kids who had a bicycle. There were no Black kids who had a motorcycle. So I ended up riding bikes with the white kids. I ended up riding motorcycles with the white kids. And so even though there were times when they would invite me into their homes and their parents would say, no, you can't invite a Black person into my home. You know, the other white guys can stay, but you've got to go. And as I looked around, they were just as poor as I was. And, it was something I think that I learned from my grandmother, which is about compassion and understanding first compassion and about why people are who they are and what they're like, the things that have brought them to this. And I think that unless we can come to understand that as an African American, unless I can come to understand the plight of poor whites, then I don't think I can ever convince any of them to be on my side in my quest for freedom in this country. Because in my opinion, both of us are denied this freedom that we want, this economic, ability to do the things that we need to do for our families. And I think that we all have the same common struggle. I'm more of the person that's like Jesse Jackson when he built his Rainbow Coalition, which brought together poor whites, poor Blacks, because he was able to show the commonalities of these experiences. Plus, for years, I've been doing video stories of whites who've had Confederate flags in their front yards. I don't do it now because I think that the situation is too tense, and I'm actually more fearful of walking up into someone's yard that's got a flagpole with a Confederate flag on it now than I was, say, 15 years ago. I think that I would be less welcome. As far as what happened in the situation of photographing the Open North Carolina event, it was interesting because when the two women that had the Women for Trump t-shirts on, I got out of my car and they said, "You're from the press." And I said, "No, I'm an independent photographer. And, this is, the work that I do." And so they said, "Well, what are you going to do with the images?" And I said, "Well, honestly, I'm not quite sure. I haven't photographed enough of this to know what I'm going to do with it." I said, "It may be months before I show it because I'm going to try to get enough to put together a story that tells the real story of why you're out here." And I think that maybe that because I said something like that they said, "Well, okay, well, let me show you, here's my Women for Trump t-shirt." Because I think that they said that, I hope that they believed that I was someone that was going to present their story in a fair way. And that was not going to be critical and say that, these crazy people who are talking about opening up the state of North Carolina in the middle of this pandemic. And, because I think that personally, when I pull back and I talk about what's my opinion of it, I realized that more African Americans were dying, that we were more likely to fall victim to, catching the disease. And there were lots of reasons that I should have been on the other side. But I knew that to do this work, that I had to be fair, that I couldn't come out there and expect people to give me who they were when I was not fair and truthful to them.
Thank you, Titus. Hey, Titus, do you mind if I let go of your screen share so we can have you up on the screen
Oh,
full
sure. Yeah.
size?
Do
I
I
can do
need
it.
to?
I'll do it. There you go. I gotcha.
Okay. Is that better?
Okay. Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay.
So we have a question here. Well, there was a comment up. So Maureen, I don't know if she's still here, made a comment that when art is personal, political, and beautiful, it can enter the space where change can happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what we're all hoping for. We're hoping for some sort of change that will allow us to continue, because I really do believe that our democracy is truly in jeopardy now. It's not just Black Lives Matters. I think that as important as that is, that I think that America is in real trouble, that we're at the edge of self-destruction, and that if we don't figure out a way to talk to each other and to find some way to come to some conclusion about how we're going to deal with these issues, then we're not going to be here much longer. And because this is an experiment, and we have to understand that this is an experiment. There's nothing that's written down in hard text that says that this is going to continue. And it depends on what we do now is whether or not we will continue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a lovely question from Marie. I know she's here. Do you want to ask that question directly, Marie, or did you want me to read it?
Yeah, yes,
There
I'd be
you are.
happy to, because I'm in error in asking it. And Titus, thank you so much for your absolutely magnificent photos and all else. My question is, I understand your interest in the necessity of African American story being told by a Black person. You said you think the stories need to be told by a Black photographer to up the odds of accurate representation of experiences and narratives that others may not understand. But if a non-Black photographer lives in an area where there are very few Black photographers and wants to help disseminate, promote, and share the stories and mission of someone who's Black, are you saying just avoid such an attempt? And if you think it's not necessary to avoid an attempt, have you any suggestions as to how one might make that attempt?
Well, first off, as a photographer, I believe that there's enough to photograph to go around for everyone to get a piece of the table. That's what I believe. But I do say that about this, that I do believe that African American photographers should somehow be able to get the first bite of this apple.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I say that because I've been looking for a Black photographer to mentor and to take over my work, what I'm doing, for years. And I haven't been able to find one. One of the reasons is because I can't say to someone, this is the path that you take to becoming a successful Black photographer. This is the path that you take that's going to get you paid enough where you can support yourself, where you can support the work that you want to do, and that you can get the work that you want to do out in front of a proper audience. And it's kind of like but photography isn't any different from what goes on in other jobs in the country. There are plenty of African Americans out here that have college degrees that don't have jobs. one of the things I got so mad about, 15, 20 years ago was going down to, let's say, Atlanta and going into a nice place trying to find, because I love red socks, and to find these special pair of red socks that, that I don't have in my sock drawer, and going into these shoe shops and seeing these young Black men who were in their mid-20s, and they say, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from Durham." And they say, "Oh, well, I graduated from this university. I graduated from that university." And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, you graduated from this university. What are you doing in a shoe store selling socks? Now, I'm not saying anything bad about honest work, but what I am saying is that these are people with skills who aren't being used. And so how do you tell young African-American kids who are 8 and 9, go to college and this will be your path, when you can't show them examples of the majority of people who have done that this has worked for? And the only way that this can happen is if African-American photographers are given access to the media, that brings images, puts these images out, makes books from them, puts them on news and etc., and get paid to do it. And because if you're not paid to do it, I know a lot of photographers, people who have cameras, but they've got other jobs. And I know a lot of white photographers that this is all that they do. And it's because they have access. They can walk up, to the city desk and say, "Here I am, I've got this image." And it's going to get looked at. An African-American, that's not going to happen to. And that's the reason why I suggest that white photographers step back on this. It's kind of like the issue of women, and women talking about, there are all of these images of women that are created by men. And perhaps it's time that the images of women are created by women artists and that they get the benefits, from that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, or that I'm trying to, Titus is this horribly racist person. No, I'm not. I'm talking about equity. And I'm talking about when someone puts their life into doing this work, you ought to be rewarded, some way for it, because you spend a lot on it,
Yes, and I very much appreciated your mention of the exploitation, and I understand that. The question was prompted by a conversation. I live in Boone, in Western North Carolina, and my question was prompted by conversations with some photographers in Hickory and other areas, people who wanted to cover protests, and it's complicated, but that's where the question came from.
It is complicated because race in America is complicated.
For sure.
And I mean, it's like peeling back an onion. You think you've got one thing, and suddenly there it is. There are another 10 layers, down there. And as you're going through these things, there's so many things there's so much that has to be considered. And well, I guess what I would say about race in America in general, period, I think that whites are going to have to realize that this may have come to the point of where you can't have it all, and because you've got people who have simply been closed out, not because of a lack of ability or a lack of interest, but simply because of who they were, their skin color, their sexual orientation, and so just as I support all of the stuff for women's movement, and saying, you're right. And, it took me a while before I realized, and I guess that after I got hit upside the head by my wife so many times, I said, okay, I get it now. I get it now. And you know, I remember walking out of the Color Purple and was just thinking, oh my gosh, you know, Mr. had done this wonderful thing, and he was this and whatever and blah, blah, blah. And my wife just lit into me. And she said, did we not see the same movie? And I said, well, yeah, well, I saw this and I know that and whatever. And so, you know, coming from the point of a male, you know, there was so much that I had to protect of being male, of my male privilege. And it was understanding what that male privilege was doing to her that you know, before I could end up having a good relationship with her. That's fortunate. It's lasted 30 some years. And you know, and she smiles and she says to me, I don't want to live, I wouldn't have never have been able to live with anyone else. Thank you. And it's because I've come around to understanding what is her position in life and just understanding my male privilege and what that affords me. Because I grew up in a house where my mother was a teacher. She taught school. She came home. She cooked dinner. She cleaned the house. My father came in, who was a porter at a place. And what he did was he took off his work boots and he sat down in his chair and he told me to turn the TV on and to change the channel. And that was all he did until he went to bed. And so, you know, so I grew up thinking, gee, maybe someone's going to do that for me. And it was when I realized, no, that's not the way life is supposed to be, that I had to get rid of these notions that I grew up with that were wrong and that were oppressive to someone that I loved, that I was trying to stay within reasonable small confines of a house with. You know, I had to forget about all of that stuff. And, you know, I said to people, I said, well, you know, I told this guy last night, I said, you know, well, maybe what we have to have is white people need to realize they're staying in houses that are, say, maybe 3,500 square feet. And Black people are staying in places that are 1,200 square feet. Maybe they need to give up 500 square feet because that family needs more room. And it may hurt, but the thing is that it will make society better. And it'll make society better because I don't think that anyone knows for sure that the cure for cancer is going to come from someone that lives in an upper middle class neighborhood. It may be the person that lives in the housing projects. And how are you going to deny that person the education, the assistance that's perhaps going to help cure one of the diseases that's so detrimental for everybody on this planet? I mean, how do we know? Can we take that chance? And that's what I'd say about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Titus, I think we're just going to take questions in the order. So Bruce, you're up next. Are you still here? Bruce might have left us. No, he's still. Bruce, are you there? You're muted. Oh, there he comes. There he is. Yes, we can hear you.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Titus, I have a question for you, but I want to make a comment on what you just said. You were just talking about two really powerful oppressive structures. You were talking about the one of race, and you were also talking about the one of gender. Mm-hmm. For guys like me, I grew up with both of them, on the wrong side of both of them. But,
yeah.
So
I grew up in Texas.
So that was a fascinating. I really liked that riff. My question for you was, before you talked about feeling the danger of going out and photographing the way you do COVID stuff, protest stuff. And the pictures I've seen of you, you're using something like an M9 or an M10, and your photographs are all up close and personal. And so you did put yourself in real danger. You're surrounded by people wearing no masks in many of those photographs. And I wondered what you did, and I think it took real courage to go out and take those photographs, more than ordinary going out into a protest and taking them.
Well, so when after I came back from Cuba, I mean, I was really keyed up, and I thought that the work that I did there was beautiful, and I wanted to continue it. And you know, I'm as my grandmother would say, I'm getting a little long in the tooth. So I don't know how much longer I'm going to, you know, actually be able to do this good work. But I feel I'm at the top of my game. And so coming back and suddenly saying that you've got to stay home and stay away from people, you know, was just it was detrimental. And add to that the fact that 5 years ago, well, actually longer than 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. I was bitten by 15 spiders on the right side of my body, which threw, you know, all of that, everything in a just up in the air. I had double vision. I didn't think I'd ever work again. And it was only after several surgeries and you know, some other things that I've been able to go back to work. So each year that I'm able to go out and photograph, I think is a gift, you know, to me. So when I felt that I couldn't go back, I was really bothered. But what I did was, one Sunday we were driving through East Durham, and I came across this African American church that was having an outdoor service. And as I said, I always have a camera with me. So I took my, you know, I asked her to stop, and she stopped, and she said, "Don't get close." And, you know, she gave me all of this, you know, these warnings. And I photographed, and then I came back, I got in the car, and she was so angry. And she said, "You were too close." And she said, every time I wanted to get out, she said, I knew I shouldn't because, you know, I was going to hit you or something. And this is from a woman who, after 30 some years, has never raised a voice at me. So I know she was mad. So she, you know, she said, you know, you can't do that again. And so I started back trying to do a body of work that I had done early in my photography, which was called Dark Hollow Ground, which was photographing in African American cemeteries. I said, well, maybe I can just go back and start doing that. And then, you know, all of these protests broke out. And I just said, you know, I've got to figure out this way. And I sat and I thought about how throughout my career, I photographed in places that were dangerous. I mean, that were really dangerous. I've been in situations where, you know, I put my life in jeopardy. And I just, you know, I had a conversation with her, and she said, I understand. She said, I understand, but you have to take some precautions. You can't get but so close. You can't do but this. You can't do but, you know, but that. And she also decided that whenever I went somewhere, that she was going with me, and to ensure that I kept my promises. So that, you know, so that was why. So I was masked. I had on gloves, but I stopped wearing gloves because I realized I wasn't touching anyone. I had my hands on the camera, and also I used the camera as also a shield. You know, so, you know, as I'm walking around, you know, I've got the camera here, and so that, you know, part of that's why. So the other thing about it is that for most of this protest work, I didn't shoot it with my Leica. I shot it with my Canon, the 1DX Mark II, which is a huge camera. And so this thing is, you know, suddenly it's like this instead of like this. So I've got these barriers that are there, you know, and I've got a 16 to 35 lens on it, which is about, you know, like that. So it's, it was sizable. And so that also helped with the distance. So physically, though I was close, there were some barriers that were between. And I would run in and run out. And I never, whenever people started clumping together, I sort of went the other way. And I tried to also work more on isolating people than just simply, the crowd shots, even though I did, I do have some crowd shots, but I tried to work more on isolating people and things. And of course, things like shooting the flags in the back of the trucks, that was another way, but they also told a story and an important part of the story.
Well, it's absolutely fabulous stuff. I was knocked out by it. It's just, I mean, it was, you had images I have not seen before, and I've seen thousands in the last 3 weeks. So,
well, and that's the other thing is how to figure out a way to be different, and to move away from what everyone else is doing, and I think that also comes from working in communities of difference, communities of otherness, because when you start doing this work and you go into these communities, I always ask myself, why am I going here? What is my purpose? What is the story that I'm looking for? How do I want to tell the story that I'm presented with? And understanding also that, so last week, was it last week? Yeah, 2 weeks ago, I was interviewed by a local TV station about the protests, and they interviewed me in my front yard for an hour and a half. And the piece that they put together on TV, I was disappointed with, and because it was really chopped up, but more importantly, it wasn't the story that I tried to tell them. And so going into these communities, what I try to do is I try to tell the story that the sitter wants told. I try to tell the story. I try to photograph everyone in a way that I would want someone to photograph my grandmother. And this is a woman that I loved and respected, and that I, to this day, I talk about the things that I learned from her and how they guide me through life. So of course, I don't want anyone messing with that. And I say that, why not give them the same respect that I would give my grandmother?
Titus, we have a question from Maureen. Maureen, would you like to ask directly, or do you want me to read it? You're muted.
Titus, would you say a little bit about photographing in the transgender community and what your entree is into that community? Is it the commonality of race?
That's interesting. So when my interest in photographing in that community, I think that art is cathartic for most people. And I think that we do art because there's something that's going on in our past that we're trying to work out. My working around in cemeteries and churches is because issues that I have with religion that I'm trying to work out and still haven't worked out. But growing up, I'm not a very big guy, never was. And growing up in a Black school where the focus was on the heroes were athletes, and there were these big hulks of guys, and then there were these little guys like me who got picked on, and who were said that, you're gay, you're homosexual, you're whatever, and instead of walking away and distancing myself from that, I decided, to embrace it. And everyone that I thought was gay or homosexual, whatever label we put on them now, I made them my best friends. And they were, the folks I hung out with. And so I understand the sting of being othered. in a community that you supposedly belong to. So when I started doing the work on trans people, it was because as I was in Cuba, so many trans people kept coming up in my photographs. And it wasn't my intention initially to photograph them. And I was looking at just how many of these images that I had captured, that I said that when I got my eyes straight from the autoimmune stuff, that I was going to make it my mission to do something about bringing justice and bringing awareness to that community. And part of my entree into the community was because I'm sure because I'm African American, and because I was looking for Afro-Cuban, transgender folk. And but the person who gave me the real access was this young woman, trans woman, that I met at the huge celebration that they do every year in Havana. And her name is Nomi. And I just met her, just by accident. And we were talking, and I asked her, I said, and we were in, we were on the eastern part of the island in this little town. And I said, do you know many trans people who are, Afro-trans who are in Havana? And she said, yeah. So I got a lot of friends. And I asked her if she would, what would it take for her to introduce me, to them? And she said, I'd like to do that. That would be great. And she started introducing me to her friends. And I would come back to Cuba, 4 times a year at least. And she would arrange, for me to go to people's homes, to meet them. She would arrange where they came together in someone's home, a group of them. And just, she really just put all of this together for me. And so I took advantage of what was an amazing opportunity to photograph in this community with someone who was a member. And because of that, I was welcome into this community, but also because of the way I treated them. So one Sunday, I was in Havana, and I'm photographing at this woman's house, and there were 4 girls who were living together, and 2 of them had lovers who were staying with them. And so one of them, I photographed her, and she was getting ready to get up and go to work. And somehow someone said that it was her birthday. And so I didn't have a birthday present to give her. And so I went into my my pocket. And so I gave her, I think, something like 10 kooks, which is the equivalent of probably about $10 US or $15 US. And so she was so grateful and so thankful. And so she stopped getting dressed and she sat down. And so I was, we were talking, and I said, well, isn't she going to work? And so she said, so Nomi said, she doesn't have to go to work now. She said, because the money that you gave her meant that she doesn't have to go out and ply her trade. And I said, what do you mean? And so she said, well, she explained that in the trans community, that it was very difficult for them to get jobs. And that Nomi was one of the few ones who had a real steady job that paid a nominal salary, but was something that she could depend on. And so we talked about that more. And so we left, Nomi and I left, and we had dinner. And so I talked about, asked her about, the other people, the other women. And I said, so what do they do for a living? And she kept coming up with the same thing. And that 95% of them did not have any other jobs except for the sex trade. that was the only way that they could make money. And so I said, well, okay. And I said, so you're saying that $10 makes that much of a difference? And so I just simply made it my practice that every time I photographed someone, I gave them money. And giving someone money is something that's always been against my mantra with photography. But in this case, I said, so much for this. I've got to make an exception of that, because while I don't have enough money to stop anyone from doing this all of the days of their life, I can stop it from happening for a couple of days. And so when I go back to Cuba, I take enough money with me. I say, well, I want to photograph 10 girls, and I said, fine. So I figure out a way to take an extra $200 or $300 so that I can give each of them enough money, so they don't have to do this. So I ask people, what do you need me to bring you? So I bring people everything from wigs to dresses to high heel pumps. I mean, just, so I'm out in shoe stores, and I'm shopping, and I'm trying to find shoes, and I'm looking for a size 11 pump with studs, and everybody's looking at me and they're thinking, well, where are you going to wear that? And I just say, well, don't worry about that. Do you have it? Let's just find something close to it if you don't have it, and whatever. And I'm always worried that this, that I'm going to get through customs but I take people everything from, and we've always done that in Cuba. I mean, when we first started going, we would take people medicine, everything from simple as Tylenol to aspirin to just, other things that, that they needed. And it's simply because the embargo is so hard, on folks' lives. And on this trip, this was the worst time in Cuba that I've been since what they call the special period, which was a period after the Soviets left. And it was 5 years where Cuba was saying that they were going to suffer hardships and that everyone had to pull together so that they could all survive. But this period, so whatever this administration has done, they have really cut down the supplies of everything going to the island. I mean, it was difficult for me to go to restaurants and get simply rice and beans, or rather beans and rice as I like it, because I like more beans than rice. But, it was more like it was a lot of rice and 12 beans. And the food was just bad. I mean, it's just bad. And I never liked Cuban food, but this was bad stuff. So, yeah.
Hey, Titus, we have a student of yours here that just wants to check in for a minute. I'm going to let her unmute. There she is.
Hey, Courtney.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. Welcome,
Good.
welcome.
Hey, I had typed a message and I just wanted to share with everybody that's here that, just working with you was such an experience for me. And you're such a tremendous teacher and you're so generous with your knowledge. And I always appreciated that, because you talk to some people in certain professions and they just want to cling to everything they know and not share. And you're always so generous with your knowledge, and I always appreciated that. And, I know I wasn't what you were expecting when I showed up at your studio, but you took me on. And
that's right. I did tell you that, didn't I?
You did. Yeah.
Okay.
No reason to apologize. And, hey, Maureen.
So Courtney came to me through Meredith College, and she was about to graduate. And I guess the chair of the photography department asked me if I would work with one of their students. So I said, okay, what's her name? And said, Courtney Johnson. And I said, oh, okay. Maureen has a niece named Courtney. Johnson is a common African-American name. So I'm assuming this is an African-American woman. I said, okay, great, that's cool. That's fantastic. So I, email, and I say, well, let's meet on this time, whatever. Courtney comes bouncing in my studios. Here's this young blue-eyed blonde woman. I'm saying, oh my gosh. And so I said, well, so I guess I'm going to baptize her by fire. So at the time, I was doing a book with the North Carolina Arts Council on African American music trails, which was on blues and jazz in the eastern part of the state. And so I was scheduled to go to, I can't remember the name of the small town, but yeah, Griffin, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And was going to photograph this fair, which was going to have this gospel, African American gospel singing. Several groups were going to be singing on the stage. I was going with me was my partner, Willis Smith, an African American man, filmmaker. And so I'm thinking, we have to figure out how this is going to work. And so I said, well, let's just see what she does. And about an hour into the thing, I just knew I had found the right person, because I watched Courtney. I watched her work with everyone, and she made no distinction with the way that people were handled. She talked to everyone respectfully. I mean, it was just amazing. And you know, she's wonderful. I mean, she is absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, someone needs to snap her up, you know, because I mean, she was good. I took her to Cuba with me. She worked just so well. I mean, she's great, you know, with doing this work. So yeah, thanks. Lots of love to you, Courtney.
Thank you. Lots of love to you and to Maureen, and thank you for those very kind words. That means a lot. Thank you.
Oh yeah, well, you mean a lot to us, so thank you. Thank you.
Love you guys.
Yeah, yeah, those were good times.
They were.
Juan, are you still with us?
I am.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Titus.
Hi.
Thank you so much, because this is some incredible insight, and I really appreciate everything that you've spoken about. I had a question in regards to consent and how you navigate, you know, what things you consider when you approach protesting or photographing protests, in particular at a time when, you know, with technology and the way that photographs can be used by police to, you know, to focus on certain people that are, you know, within the movement, whether it's Black Lives Matter or whatever. But I'm just curious if you can talk about that and what your personal approach and thoughts on that is, you know, whether about protecting people's identities and everything that goes along those ethics.
So if I'm doing my normal work, which is portraiture, I like to I like to get a release, and you know, it's something I've always tried to do. I think I do it less now than I used to. I think it's virtually it's impossible to do that when we're talking about something like demonstrations, because people are moving. You know, that people are moving around you, they're coming in and out. You know, if you photograph, you know, if you stop them, you know, do they have time to do that? You know, do they actually even want to? What I used to do is, because my cameras now can shoot both video and still photography, is just simply have someone click on the camera, as you know, on the video part, and have them simply say, I give permission for this, you know, this photograph, and etc. And I guess that will somewhat indemnify you, somewhat. But I think that also what you have to ask yourself is, what is my intention? And I believe that if you are honest with the intentions, with your intentions, what you're going to do with the photograph, I think that people will be okay with that. That's also a part of the chance, I believe, that people take when you come out and you demonstrate. I mean, years ago, I was a part of a, this kind of court case. And it turned out that they were trying to get that the FBI had gotten photographs of me during protests in the 60s and 70s, because I was a member of the Black Panther Party and of People's Party 2, which was an offshoot that was in Houston, and because I was part of the anti-war demonstrations, and that they still had this stuff. And so, there are these photographs of us that's everywhere. And we're in this society where we are photographed so many times a day, whether it's when we go to the ATM to get money out of the bank, or whether when we're pulling up to certain intersections. There are cameras that are everywhere. And so I think that, unfortunately, young people have become somewhat less concerned about all of this image capture. I still am, but there just isn't much that you can do about it. I do like the idea of people blacking out faces, even though, as you can see, I haven't done that with any of my images. But that's a choice. That's a choice and a chance that we all take. So I think that's something that you're going to have to make a personal decision yourself on. Where you're going to fall, on which side of the border, of that, because it is important, because agencies are clearly trolling, Instagram and Facebook and whatever, and are looking for people. Yeah, we know that. But I also think that the places and the times that I was photographing, I don't think that there was necessarily anything so going on that was, shall we say, falls into the category of illegality, where they would say, I'm going to hunt this person down. That's what I hope. So that's sort of a no answer to your question, but it's the best that I can do. And like I said, I think that what you have to do is you have to search your own soul and make the decision of what you do. And even when you're confronted about the decision that you make, then you have to be willing to defend that, that decision, and then go forward. Because I think that if you feel that your work is important, that it's important that you continue it and that you go forward with it, and you have to be ready to defend that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
Haley, are you still here?
Yes, I am.
Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So I've just always loved, of course, Titus, like your wonderful stories behind your photos, and it makes it so much more powerful. So perhaps this question is like too intimate to be shared. And I was just kind of curious how, if someone like yourself approached you hoping to photograph you, how would you choose to be? I know you mentioned you assimilate with like very many of the people that you photograph, and you share a lot of yourself with those people. So I don't know, I was just curious, like if you would feel comfortable sharing how you would portray yourself if someone asked you to photograph you in the nature that you do.
I probably have multiple personalities, and I probably have multiple ways of dressing. Many times I leave my house, I'm going out, I've got on something similar to combat boots, some combat pants. I've got NWA t-shirts, Black Lives Matter t-shirts. I've got socialist movement t-shirts and communist movement t-shirts. I mean, it's a part of who I am, what my political and social and economic policies are. So, there's that part of me. And then there's this part of me that I used to show more often, of where I like Italian suits, and I like I like gators, you know, and stuff like that. And I collect watches and kind of expensive watches too. And so I don't know how I would dress if someone wanted to say that they wanted to capture who I really am, because you know there's many parts of Titus, and I think that I've lived my life in a way that I have expressed the many Tituses in many variations, and I've tried to leave no leaf unturned in my life. And so, you know, so yeah, yeah. But I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't mind someone approaching me for a photograph. I've got one or two images that have been taken by other people that I like. I've actually got one that's in my guest bedroom that I like, that was taken of me, I don't know, 20 some years ago. And, you know, I'm in this Andrew Feza suit, which was a nice suit back then, with a collarless kind of t-shirt, you know, and you know, I just like it. So, you know, like I say, there are many parts of me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, is there anyone else out there that's sitting on a question? Anybody else? And if you're speaking, you might be on mute. sometimes that happens.
So let me say hello to Paul from England.
Yeah, it's getting late here in England, but it's been fascinating.
I know it's got to be what, 3 or 4 in the morning.
No, it's just 2 a.m. But
oh, really? Oh, okay.
It's I didn't know you were in the Black Panthers. I've been wondering whatever happened to the Black Panthers. It's
well, we're kind of old now.
yeah, but
we're the Gray Panthers.
yeah.
Yeah. So Paul's a photographer. He just moved to England with his wife about what, 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Yeah, four years. Yeah.
Yeah. We used to hang out together around Raleigh. Yeah, he's a good shooter. Good guy too. Good guy. It's good to see you.
Thanks.
Titus, this is Nikki and Ellie.
Oh, hey. Hello.
Hey. I was gonna comment on as a person who you have asked for permission to photograph.
Yes.
I find your method of approaching people quite entertaining.
Do you want to say more?
Sure.
So let me tell this story. So we were in this, Maureen and I were in this Thai restaurant having dinner with a friend, and in walks this African American woman, and it's Nikki. She's albino. She has these long dreads, and she walks in and she sits down and she starts talking with this other person. And I'm sitting there and I'm mesmerized. And I'm just thinking, I've got to photograph her. And all I'm thinking is, if I go and ask her, she's gonna slap my face, and worse probably. And so after about 20 minutes, I finally leaned over to Maureen and I said, okay, come rescue me if she starts to beat me up, you know, or something or whatever. And, you know, and she says, okay. So I walk over and I said, hi, I'm Titus Heagins. And I don't like business cards because I think people throw them away. I just don't do them. And I said, I'm a photographer. And so she looks at me and I said, no, I'm really a real photographer, you know? and I said, I would, and I said, you know, I would really like to photograph you yeah, I don't mean to intrude and you know, just all this kind of stuff like, please forgive me, but I've just got to ask. And she looked at me and she smiled and she said, okay. And that's where it began. So, and that was 11 years ago, Nikki, now?
Yeah, it was 2009.
Yeah. So I've been, you know, so the two boys that were standing by the river, Chris and Xavier, those are her nephews. And so, you know, I mean, I've photographed, you know, her family, you know, since then. And like I said earlier, we do Christmas, Thanksgiving, and everything together. When my family comes to visit me from Texas, I make sure that I take them, you know, down far east where Nikki's family lives. So, you know, so that everybody can meet everybody. And her father fries fish for Maureen because Maureen loves fried fish and I don't eat fried fish. So that's a good out for me. And but yeah. And this and her friend Ellie there is absolutely wonderful, and we've fallen in love with her. So you know, it's just been great. I mean, it's so, to me, photographing people, it's about relationships, and you know, it's, these things go on and on and on, and as you learn more and more about them, then you can photograph them in ways that I think that are more honest, that are more true, that are more akin to who they are, that you can find a way to understand how to bring the soul of that person into an image so that it can be understood when someone views it. And that's what photography is about to me. That's what it's about. It's about bringing the soul of someone out to let someone experience and understand who they are, what their life is about. And hopefully you can make some sort of connection, you know, with that, and bring some understanding about your life. Because we all want the same thing. You know, we all want love, understanding, and, you know, a quarter orange juice in the refrigerator.
And fried fish.
Thanks,
and
Nick.
fried fish.
Thanks, Nikki. And I took Nikki 20-some rolls of toilet paper during the COVID thing.
That's a true friend. Thank you.
Thank you, too.
Well, that feels like a beautiful note to end on, seeing the soul of others through the process of making beautiful images. We so appreciate you being here, and we have recorded this this talk, and so you can, usually takes us about half a week to a week to get it back up on the website. So if you want to revisit this conversation, you will find it there. And we hope that some of you will be able to join us next week for our community call. And it's been such a pleasure, Titus. And thank you so much for your generosity and for your beautiful work, and for your continued work in the photographic community.
I've still got a few more years left in me.
And I also wanted to say that often when these talks are happening, people type beautiful and encouraging and messages. They're border on blessings, and so I'll get a copy of all the chat stuff, and I'll make sure to email that to you.
Because I haven't seen any of that.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there's some beautiful comments and messages here for you. So I'll make sure that.
And send me the bad ones too.
Well, I can't edit, so you get it all. Yes.
Okay. All right.
And as
Thank
always,
you very much for having me. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your comments, for everyone that showed up. It's just good seeing and hearing from old friends and from new people. And thank you for your comments about my work. I've been seriously dedicated to this task, And you know, it's been my life, and I go to bed at night thinking about the next image that I'm going to create, and I really wake up the next morning thinking about the next image that I'm going to create. So it has consumed me. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right.
Good night.
Thanks, Maureen.
Yeah, she's
Thank you.
my anchor. I couldn't do any of this without her.
She's wonderful.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Beautiful.
Thank you for those comments about my work, Bruce. I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate the work. It's this has been a great evening. I've loved it.
Good. Glad.
So keep on.
Don't have a choice.
Yeah, I know.
It's too late to do anything else.
There'll be plenty of material.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
At all.
Thank you, Titus. That was incredible. I'm just overwhelmed. I had so many questions. I didn't ask one, but I was really inspired. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I love your work. It's incredible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I love doing the work. So it's you know, it was something I stumbled into, but you know, I didn't start off thinking about being a photographer. And I mean, I came to this late in life, and you know, so it's been, you know, it's just making a decision that this is what I'm going to do, and then going forward with that, you know, just no matter what, just keep on.
Yeah.
Keep on. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go to bed tonight thinking of my next image. So thank you.
There you go. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Paul, how's Janet?
She's doing good. She's doing good.
Good.
She's retired. Fortunately, she was retired. She was doing some contract work in London, and fortunately, she retired before the big virus hit. So, you know, train travel, I think, is dangerous now. So we've just been hunkered down at the apartment.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what we're all doing, one way or the other. Yeah, that's what we're all doing. But soon it'll be over, hopefully, if we're lucky.
We hope.
Yeah, if we're lucky. Well, you take care. And I owe you an email.
Really?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I'll get it to you.
We'll be in touch.
All right. Okay. Take it easy.
I know.
All right. Bye-bye.